When it stood immediately before him, he reached out to its trunk with a flat palm and felt the smoothness. He ran one eye up and among its closely spaced limbs. There was a shimmy spot about halfway up to contend with, but past that was a forked set of branches, a natural place to sit and get comfortable. He reached up and grabbed a limb with both hands. Then he pulled himself up, his feet walking the trunk. When they were higher than his hands, he swung a leg over and reached for a branch above. One by one, he chose his next footholds, with a keen, almost preternatural deliberateness, and made it to the shimmy spot. The next branch was well out of reach. He wrapped his arms tightly around the trunk, just able to get all the way around it, and did the same with his feet. It was more than a little frightening, because he was now totally committed. Should he get up, getting down was going to be just as precarious, if not more so. With his arms cinched tight, he lifted his encircled legs a few inches, pushing his feet alongside. In this way, he drove his body up each time, readjusting his bear hug. After a few of these slow but no less effective efforts, he reached out for that next saving branch. Then he rested a moment to note how high he was, again a little worried about getting down. He put it out of his mind and gazed up along an alternate trunk. With butterflies in his stomach, he continued on the last bit of climbing until he all but ran out of tree and branch to support him. The fork indeed made the perfect seat. He sat there, feet dangling, swaying in the wind, peering out in all directions through the thinner foliage. The treetops all around were a sea of color, and birds of all kinds, most of whose names he knew not, could be seen winging about and then disappearing within the multitude of autumn leaves. There were many sparrows and little colonies everywhere chattering at once, a collective choral that rose in intensity on high. A blue jay came swooping into a neighboring treetop with an alarm call. They were mutually spooked by each other's presence. A nuthatch strolled upside down on a limb nearby, making a low-pitched wah, wah, wah. He sat there watching a while and regained his breath. He couldn't see a rooftop or any sign of another person anywhere in the vicinity. A peculiar feeling crept over him. For the first time today, he wished someone had accompanied him to his forest. A friend, perhaps. He suddenly, if only momentarily, longed for someone to share this place with, to reside over it with him in the future. She came to mind, as she often did when he was alone. He thought about how much he liked to talk to her, and in spite of this, how little substance was actually shared when he got his chance. Though he missed her, it kind of felt good to revel in the sad feeling that her company, but mainly her absence, brought. He would, of course, never admit something like that to anyone, let alone her. Then the wind picked up again, and he held tightly to an overhead branch, but purposely leaned out and over the forest floor below, frightening himself a little. The faraway feeling came back easily, accompanied with a sense of flight, a sinking, pit-like feeling in his stomach of actual falling. When it stopped and all was serene once again, he resumed scoping the surrounding area for new points of interest. Then he realized he had not yet given a name to this wonderful maple. He decided to wait until he was safely on the ground looking back up before adding it to the map, lest it later need amending as Broken Neck Maple. There was one thing he could do before descending, something he had been meaning to do somewhere in earnest for some time now. Careful not to roll out of the tree, he reached in his pocket and retrieved the knife. Placing the knife in his mouth, he slid forward to the trunk, even though it meant giving up the natural seat. He stood more firmly on a branch below to free up his arms, with a branch between the knees for balance. He pried open the largest blade and went about leaving his mark. It was a bit more difficult than he had ever anticipated. Still, the maple's bark gave way easily enough, and pretty soon he had perfected a technique of sorts. He would first cut a line about the edges of the letter, and then carefully dig out the space within. By taking more of the wood away and deepening his mark, it became more pronounced, and he imagined it indelible for years to come. On a slope in one letter, as he was turning the knife, the blade closed on his middle finger with a startling ease. It left a small and itchy, if only just barely painful, cut. He sucked at the salty drop of blood. Sharp enough after all. The bleeding didn't last long, and he carved on through the discomfort. When he was finished, he admired his work intently, running his fingers over the letters and closing his eyes to read them. He thought about putting her name along with his, a thought he decided to consider a while first. His hand was a little cramped anyway, so he instead began the climb down. Dropping through several branches, he arrived at the shimmy spot again. He took a deep breath and slid down below the safety of handholds, just as he had done on the way up to the perch. His arms grew tired, though, and this time he began to slip. As he did, his legs came loose and dangled. He tightened his arms in response, but slid down a few inches before catching his weight, but not before scraping up the insides of his forearms and biceps. Looking down in a growing panic, he grappled his legs to regain control. It was a close and frightening call, and he now had abrasions on the insides of both arms to join the cut on his finger. Dropping safely on a branch again, he was exasperated. He clung there, head swimming and heart pounding, looking at the ground. He again felt drawn by some invisible force that cared little for danger. He couldn't help but wonder, what would it be like? And leaned out again daringly before deciding that don't look down was probably good and lifelong advice. While paused there, his eye caught something in the distance, strange and white. It looked out of place, barely visible through the trees. He couldn't make out what it was, just that it was hardly naturally occurring. It had been hidden from view on the ground and also aloft, but halfway down a hole in the vegetation revealed it glinting in the sunlight. "Should I check that out?" he said. "Of course," was the answer. There was often a running dialogue in his head, occasionally spoken aloud, perhaps less occasionally answered. Things like, "I almost lost it there," followed by, "That would not have been good." A response was usually warranted when weighing the relative difficulty or desire of any particular effort. Like, "Think I can make that? I don't think so." He scurried most of the way down before finally hanging impatiently, then dropping from roughly twice his height. The impact drove his rump into the ground a little, but he brushed it off. Grabbing 2 lemon candies for his dry mouth from his pile on the plateau, he set off in the direction of the curiosity. He savored his steps, waiting every so often to listen and observe every detail. All the while he kept an eye out for the object while working his way to it in an indirect but deliberate fashion. He came to a square of somewhat dilapidated stones. There an iron fence leaned and was missing in places. A tiny old cemetery lay within its boundary. He stopped and stared at the tombstones, realizing what this was. Before him were some sun-bleached headstones with long, dark stains eerily covering the epitaphs. He drew closer, but with less enthusiasm, his curiosity metered by reverence and a creepy feeling. The old gate, rusted and hanging by one lone hinge, leaned away, like someone had long ago visited and forgotten to close it when they left. Creeping closer still, he reached out to touch the wrought iron, running his hand up its rusted roughness to the gate and attempting to close it on the one good hinge. It was frozen in the layers of leaf and earth at its feet and moved little. He stopped lifting and pushing at the resistance and instead turned sideways and slid through the open space. He did this reluctantly, looking around again as if someone were watching. When he was within the confines of the graveyard officially, he reached back to feel the gate again, just to make sure it really couldn't close him inside. The leaves were high with many autumns, and there was a relic fallen branch laying across the square in varying depth. Most of the gravestones, he counted about 10 or so, were no more than a piece of slate with one end in the ground, broken off, appearing to never have been inscribed at all. He checked for any surface crawlers, then half sat against the waist-high stone wall at a place where the iron fence was missing. Most prominently before him, the tallest headstone of thin marble was bathed in sunlight and had been the beacon he saw while climbing down the lookout tree. It was nearly as tall as he was, with rounded top and a long lost inscription. The lesser markers of its class were nearly all blackened and worn until there weren't any distinguishable names or dates left to tell him who was buried beneath his feet. Yet he knew for sure that they were beneath the forest floor. Although no one very close to him had died yet, he would, eventually. Despite how empty his understanding, it was nonetheless obvious. Despite all the different interpretations he was aware of, and the abject fear of this unknown, death was obvious. He grew frightened at his thoughts. To boot, the sun had gone behind an enormous cloud and was casting an ominous shadow over his tiny boneyard. Tears were once again welling easily at the powerlessness of reality, and suddenly nothing felt safe anymore. And what of these people? Where had they spent their lives? To end up deposited here to slow reclamation by the surrounding woods, with nary a visitor in ages. The breeze brushed over his shoulder, and before he knew it, he was dashing out of the cemetery. The deep leaves slowed his escape just enough for near panic to take hold. He turned sideways to scoot out, looking back at the monolith. He staggered away, waiting to feel secure again, but part of him felt as though he might never.